My name is Sarah, and I never imagined my life would end like this. One moment, everything was normal. Just another day, following the familiar rhythm of my routine, completely unaware that something catastrophic was about to happen. I always assumed that if death came for me, I would see it coming. Maybe in old age, surrounded by family, or at the very least with some kind of warning, a lingering illness, a gut feeling that something was wrong. But that's not what happened. One moment, I was fine. The next, everything changed. The day started like any other. There was nothing to suggest that this would be anything but another ordinary day. I woke up, made my morning coffee, answered a few emails, and went about my routine as if my future was certain. The sky was overcast, but there was no heaviness in the air, at least none that I could feel. I had plans for the weekend, things I was looking forward to. I had a future ahead of me, or so I thought. The first sign that something was wrong came suddenly, without warning. A dull, nagging pressure began to build at the back of my head. At first, I brushed it off. Just another headache, probably from staring at my screen too long or maybe not drinking enough water. I ignored it, even as my vision blurred slightly at the edges, even as my thoughts felt a little too slow, a little too distant. But then, the pain sharpened, and it was unlike anything I had ever felt before. A crushing weight deep inside my skull, as if something had burst within me. My breath hitched, my knees nearly buckled. The room around me swayed, tilting in a way that made no sense. My heart pounded violently in my chest, its rhythm frantic, disjointed, out of sync with time itself. I tried to move, to steady myself, but my legs no longer felt like my own. My vision blurred further, darkening at the edges. I could hear my own breath, shallow, ragged, but it sounded distant, as if it belonged to someone else. My body was betraying me, slipping from my control piece by piece. A deep, primal sense of wrongness flooded through me, something my mind couldn't fully process. I was falling, and then, nothing. For a moment, everything just stopped. I was weightless, caught in an eerie silence, suspended between one breath and the next. I braced myself for the impact, the sharp, jarring sensation of my body hitting the floor, the rush of pain as I collapsed. But it never came. Instead, there was nothing. No sensation, no sound, just emptiness. And then, I saw myself. At first, my mind struggled to make sense of what I was looking at. It was me, but it wasn't. My body lay motionless on the floor, limbs awkwardly sprawled, my face pale and still. A strange detachment settled over me, a disconnect between what I was seeing and what I was experiencing. How could I be looking at myself? How was this even possible? Panic should have consumed me. But instead, a deep, unnatural calm wrapped around me. I wanted to reach out, to move, to shake myself awake, but I wasn't in my body anymore. Something was pulling me away. At first, it was gentle, like an unseen current nudging me forward. Then it grew stronger, more insistent. The world around me began to fade, the edges dissolving into a soft, glowing light. It was warm, familiar, yet utterly unknown. I had no control, no way of resisting. I expected to wake up in a hospital, surrounded by the steady beeping of machines, the hushed voices of doctors and nurses. But I was wrong, because I wasn't waking up. I was somewhere else. I hovered in a state of disbelief, staring down at the lifeless form beneath me. It was me, but I wasn't in it. My body lay still on the floor, my face pale, my lips slightly parted, as if frozen in the middle of a breath I never got to finish. A wave of cold realization washed over me. I was outside of myself. Panic surged through me like an electric current. This wasn't supposed to happen. My mind refused to accept it. This had to be a dream, some kind of out-of-body hallucination caused by whatever was happening in my head. Any second now, I would wake up, gasping for air, feeling the cool sheets of a hospital bed beneath my fingertips, hearing the distant voices of doctors working to bring me back. But as I looked down at the scene unfolding before me, I knew this wasn't a dream. Movement caught my attention. People rushed into the room, their voices rising in alarm, though they sounded distant, muffled, as if I were hearing them through water. Someone called my name, but it meant nothing. I wasn't there anymore. 2 paramedics knelt beside my body. One pressed 2 fingers to my neck, searching for something I already knew wasn't there. The other spoke quickly into a radio clipped to their shoulder. Sharp, urgent words, the kind that only come out in life or death situations. This was real. This was happening. I tried to speak, to tell them I was still here, that I could see them, hear them, but no sound came out. I tried to reach out, to grab onto something, anything, but I had no hands, no weight, no substance. I was nothing but awareness, a presence without form. A crushing sense of helplessness overtook me. I had always believed in control, in grounding myself in logic and reason, in taking charge of situations. But now I was a spectator in the most crucial moment of my life, the moment it ended. I wanted to fight, to resist, to force myself back into my body, but something else had other plans. The pull returned, at first, subtle, like an unseen tide, gently drawing me away. Then, it strengthened. My surroundings, the paramedics, the flashing lights, my own breathless body, began to fade. It was as if an invisible door had been left open, and I was being swept toward it. I struggled against it, but it was useless. There was no fighting it. The world around me blurred, stretching at the edges like fabric pulled too tight. Then, in an instant, everything collapsed into darkness. But the darkness wasn't empty. Far ahead, in the vast nothingness, something began to take shape. At first, it was just a faint glow, soft, distant. Then it grew, expanding, shifting, until it became a tunnel of radiant golden light. But this wasn't just light. It was alive. It pulsed, beckoning, reaching out with something beyond human comprehension. It wasn't just a glow. It was a presence. Something greater. Something that knew me. Something that had been waiting. A deep, overwhelming wave of emotions surged through me. Peace and terror, awe and fear, longing and hesitation, all at once. I wanted to go back. I wasn't ready for this, but I had no choice. The pull grew stronger, and before I could resist, I was moving. Not walking, not flying, just being drawn forward. The light surrounded me, enveloped me, consumed me. And as I was pulled deeper into it, one thought rose above all others. I knew I was dead, but that wasn't the part that scared me. The pull was relentless, dragging me deeper into the overwhelming radiance ahead. I had no control over where I was going, no say in what was happening to me. I was being taken somewhere beyond the limits of anything I had ever known. The tunnel of light surrounded me, pulsing with something more than just illumination. It was energy, warmth, and something deeper, something that felt as though it had been waiting for me my entire life. I moved effortlessly, though I had no feet, no body, yet I was fully present. There was no gravity, no sense of up or down, just the undeniable sensation of being drawn toward something greater than myself. And then, I emerged. The tunnel gave way to an expanse of pure, indescribable light. It stretched endlessly in every direction, infinite, yet not empty. The very air, if it could even be called air, was alive with warmth, with a radiance that didn't just illuminate, but seemed to know me. The light wasn't harsh or blinding. It was soft, yet more real than anything I had ever experienced. It had depth, movement, something unearthly, something eternal. And then, I saw him. A figure stood in the midst of the light. At first, I couldn't make out the details of his face. But I knew who he was before my mind could even process it, because my soul had already recognized him. Jesus. There was no hesitation, no doubt. The moment I saw him, I understood. It was like unlocking a memory I had always carried but had never uncovered until now. I had known him before this moment. I had known him my whole life, even when I didn't realize it, even when I had questioned, even when I had wandered, even when I had ignored the truth. He had always been there. I couldn't move, not because I was paralyzed with fear, but because I was completely overwhelmed by his presence. It was more than just seeing him. It was feeling him. The intensity of his presence washed over me like an ocean, deeper than anything humanly imaginable, more powerful than any love I had ever known. It was all-consuming, absolute, undeniable. His radiance wasn't just light. It was love itself. His love surrounded me, filled every part of me, reaching places inside me I hadn't even realized were empty. It was a love so complete, so infinite, that nothing in the world could ever compare. And yet, despite the overwhelming love that radiated from him, there was something else in his eyes. Sorrow. Deep, profound sorrow. So vast, so consuming, that it was unlike anything I had ever seen before. This was not the sorrow of a man, but of someone who had watched humanity for lifetimes. Someone who had seen everything. His eyes met mine, and in that instant, I felt my soul laid bare before him. There was nothing I could hide, nothing I could conceal. He saw me, all of me, the good, the bad, the broken, the regrets, the failures. Yet there was no condemnation in his gaze, only truth. And then, he spoke. Sarah. The sound of my name from his lips sent a shockwave through me. It wasn't just hearing it, it was being known. Truly, deeply, completely known. Every thought I had ever had, every secret I had ever buried, every moment of my existence, he had seen it all. And still, he loved me. I wanted to fall to my knees, to cry, to weep, to beg to stay in this place forever. But before I could speak, he continued. You were not meant to die today. His voice was unlike anything I had ever heard. Powerful yet tender, filled with both authority and love. It wasn't just a voice. It was truth itself. Every word carried weight beyond language, resonating deep within me, as if they were being spoken not just to my ears, but to my very soul. I wasn't meant to die today. Then why was I here? Before I could ask, he answered the question forming in my mind. There is something you must see. My breath, if I even had breath in this place, caught in my throat. There was urgency in his tone. Not panic, not fear, but something else. Something that told me that whatever he was about to show me was important. I opened my mouth to ask what he meant, but before I could utter a single word, the world around me shifted. The radiant light around us began to change, bending, folding, pulling me forward into something else. The warmth faded, the love remained, but the scene before me transformed. And then, he showed me what was coming. The light around me dimmed, replaced by something heavier, something darker. It wasn't like falling, and yet, I felt myself being pulled forward, carried into a new reality, a different place, a different time. My body, if I even had one here, felt weightless, yet I was completely aware of my movement. I wasn't just being shown something from afar. I was inside it, made to witness it as though I were truly there. The brilliance that had surrounded Jesus faded into a gray, almost suffocating haze. The air felt thick, charged with something unspoken but deeply unsettling. And then, as if my vision had suddenly adjusted, I saw it. The world was different. The sky above was dark, not from nightfall, but from something unnatural, something looming. The very air seemed tainted, heavy with an energy that sent a shiver through my soul. I stood in the middle of a city, but this wasn't the world I had known. People flooded the streets, but it wasn't a celebration. It was chaos. I turned, watching as crowds surged forward, their faces twisted with anger and desperation. Protests. Thousands of voices shouting, screaming, demanding. Their words blended into a deafening roar of unrest, sending chills through me. Some held signs, though I couldn't read all of them. Their messages blurred in the madness, but I caught glimpses. No more lies. We want justice. The system has failed us. Then, massive screens lit up across the city. Enormous digital billboards flickered, displaying news anchors, world leaders, urgent headlines flashing along the bottom. The faces on the screens looked strained, exhausted, some even panicked. Their voices were flat, carefully measured, as if trying to contain something much bigger than themselves. I caught snippets of their words, fragments that made my stomach drop. Economic collapse, unrest, emergency measures, and then a phrase that sent a chill through me. The world stands on the brink. The screens changed, flashing rapid sequences of images, each more unsettling than the last. A stock market graph plummeting, sharp red warnings of a financial crisis worse than anything before. Governments scrambling, currencies collapsing overnight, entire nations struggling to control the panic. I turned away, but suddenly, the scene around me shifted. I was no longer in the city. Now, I stood on the edge of destruction. Beneath me, the earth trembled violently. Earthquakes. I watched in horror as buildings shook, massive cracks splitting highways, entire structures crumbling into dust while people screamed and ran. The sky darkened further, and I felt the atmosphere change. Storms. Towering hurricanes tore through the land, their winds howling with a force beyond comprehension, uprooting trees, ripping apart homes as if they were made of paper. I was being taken from place to place, forced to witness devastation on a scale I had never imagined. Fires, floods, riots breaking out in the streets as desperation took hold. But in all of it, something felt off. The leaders on the screens, the reporters with their urgent voices, the officials making grave announcements. They didn't have the answers. They were lost. They stood before microphones, reading carefully crafted statements, delivering words that were meant to reassure, but their voices were hollow. They didn't know what to do. They were scrambling, grasping for solutions that simply weren't there. And then, I heard it. At first, I thought it was coming from the people, the crowds shouting, the newscasters speaking in strained tones. But no, these voices weren't coming from human mouths. They were beneath the surface, woven through the chaos, hidden yet fully present. Whispers. A shiver ran through me. It wasn't just panic fueling this disaster. Something else was at work. Something unseen. I felt it. An influence, an agenda, pushing the world deeper into disorder. It wasn't just political. It wasn't just environmental. It wasn't just economic. It was spiritual. And suddenly, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned, desperate to escape the vision, to pull myself back. But I couldn't. I wasn't in control. Then, in the midst of the chaos, a voice called my name. It was clear, powerful, a voice that cut through the madness like a blade, a voice that carried authority over everything I was seeing. And I knew that voice. I spun around, my heart pounding. Jesus was there. I stood frozen as Jesus gazed at me, his presence unwavering amidst the storm of chaos unraveling before my eyes. His expression carried both love and sorrow, the weight of something he had seen unfold too many times before. Around us, the world continued to fracture. People shouted in rage. The earth trembled. The skies churned with a darkness that felt alive. But none of it moved him. He stood firm, unshaken, a foundation that could not be broken. And when he spoke, his voice carried through the madness with absolute authority. The world stands at a crossroads. His words echoed through me, reverberating deep within my soul. This wasn't just a statement. It was a warning. I turned, looking back at the devastation surrounding us, the desperate faces, the hopelessness creeping into every corner of the world. Even those in power, the leaders who had spent their entire lives climbing to the top, looked lost. Jesus raised his hand slightly, and in an instant, the vision before me shifted. I saw people turning away from him, rejecting everything holy, mocking faith. Churches stood empty, not because people had stopped believing entirely, but because they no longer cared. Convenience, comfort, and self-gratification had become their gods. Right and wrong had blurred so completely that nothing was sacred anymore. A deep sense of loss settled over me. This wasn't just the corruption of governments. This was spiritual decay. People no longer sought truth. Instead, they created their own versions of it, twisting reality to fit whatever pleased them. And yet, even in the midst of this great falling away, I saw something else. A remnant. Scattered among the darkness, there were those still holding on. A grandmother knelt in prayer, her lips moving as she wept for her children, begging God to save them. A young man clutched his Bible to his chest, hiding it from those who mocked him. A small church gathered in secret, their voices soft as they worshipped, afraid the world would hear them. The faithful remained, but they were few. I turned to Jesus, my heart pounding. Why are you showing me this? What does this mean? His eyes held mine. You must warn them. The weight of those words crashed down on me like a tidal wave. This wasn't just something I was witnessing, it was something I was being called to speak. I turned back to the world unraveling before me. The disasters weren't random. The chaos wasn't just a series of unfortunate events. They were warnings. The earthquakes weren't just shifts in the earth. The storms weren't just changes in the atmosphere. The fires weren't just accidents. They were signs. Signs that were being ignored. People dismissed them, calling them climate events, political failures, economic consequences. They looked for explanations in science, in data, in the voices of experts, but never in God. They refused to see the truth. The earth was groaning, crying out in response to the spiritual sickness that had taken root. Division was spreading, not just between nations, but within families, within churches. I saw husbands and wives at war with each other, parents abandoning their children, children rejecting their parents. People who once loved each other now filled with hatred, over ideologies, over money, over power. Even those who called themselves followers of Christ turned against each other, consumed by pride, by anger, by the belief that they alone held the truth. It was all unraveling. I turned back to Jesus, my chest tightening with desperation. Lord, can this be stopped? His answer shook me. Jesus stood before me, his gaze unwavering, filled with both love and the weight of divine truth. His presence alone was enough to calm the storm of fear rising inside me, but the heaviness in his voice made my spirit tremble. I had asked if this could be stopped, if there was still hope. In response, he lifted his hand. The chaos around me froze. The fires stopped spreading. The screams fell silent. The raging storms and collapsing buildings halted mid-destruction. Everything was suspended, caught between past and future, between warning and fulfillment. And then, the world shifted again. Before me, I saw two paths. One stretched toward light, a world where the air was clear, where peace and righteousness flourished, where hope had taken root again. The sky no longer carried the weight of impending disaster, but radiated warmth, like the sun breaking through after a storm. I saw people gathering, not in protest, not in division, but in unity. Families were restored. Churches were filled with life again. Hearts turned back to God. There was still struggle, still hardship, but it was different. Fear no longer ruled. Then I turned and saw the other path. The moment my eyes fell upon it, a chill crawled down my spine. This was the world if nothing changed, and it was far worse than anything I had already seen. The protests had turned violent. Cities were overrun with chaos. Law and order had completely dissolved. People weren't just fighting over politics anymore. They were fighting for survival. The financial collapse I had glimpsed before, now it was total. Money was meaningless. People bartered, stole, turned on one another. There was no trust, only desperation. The natural disasters hadn't stopped. They had worsened. The earthquakes didn't just shake cities. They split the land apart. The storms didn't just bring wind and rain. They swallowed entire regions. The fires weren't just burning forests. They were consuming everything, leaving nothing behind. But the worst part, the part that made my soul tremble, was the darkness. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was a presence, a force that spread like an infection, seeping into every corner of the world. The whispers I had heard before, the unseen manipulation twisting reality, had now taken full control. People were no longer just deceived. They were enslaved by it. I turned back to Jesus, my breath coming in shaky gasps. I wanted to plead, to beg him to make it stop, to tell me this wasn't set in stone, that there was still a way to turn things around. Before I could speak, he answered. "The choice is still open," he said. "But time is running out." The weight of his words pressed into me. We weren't doomed, not yet, but the window to change, to turn back, to seek mercy instead of judgment. It was closing. I looked back at the two paths. They weren't just possible futures. They were choices. The world had a choice. People had a choice. And what happened next would depend on whether that choice was made. Before it was too late, I turned to Jesus, desperation rising in my voice. "How do we stop this? What must we do?" His eyes, full of both sadness and hope, met mine. "Return to me." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of eternity. Repent. Turn away from sin. Turn away from pride. Turn away from the hatred, the greed, the arrogance, the selfishness that had blinded so many. Turn back to Him. And suddenly, I understood. This wasn't about one nation, one leader, or one event. This was about the world as a whole, the hearts of people, the spirit of mankind. Humanity had drifted too far, too lost in its own desires, too distracted by its own self-importance to see the danger it had invited upon itself. This wasn't just political. This wasn't just environmental. This wasn't just economic. This was spiritual. And without a return to God, nothing would stop what was coming. I felt the urgency deep in my soul. This warning wasn't just for me. It was for everyone. And then, as I looked into Jesus' eyes, the world shifted again. The radiant light around us faded, replaced by something heavier. A deep sense of unease crept over me. I wasn't ready for what I was about to see, but I had no choice. The air grew thick, charged with an energy I couldn't describe, like the entire atmosphere was holding its breath for something inevitable. And then, I saw it. At first, it was subtle, a shift in the air, an unspoken tension running through the world like an invisible fault line. But then, everything began to unravel at once. People were glued to their screens, their faces pale with confusion and disbelief. News anchors spoke in rushed, urgent tones, struggling to mask the panic creeping into their voices. I couldn't hear every word, but fragments of headlines flashed before my eyes. Unprecedented global event shocks the world. Markets plunge as chaos unfolds. Governments scramble for control. Leaders in crisis talks. What happens next? I was transported from place to place, witnessing the world's reaction. In some countries, riots erupted, people flooding the streets, demanding answers, desperate to make sense of what was happening. Governments scrambled. Their leaders, once so confident, now looked lost, unsure, grasping for control. Inside boardrooms, powerful men and women sat in tense silence, eyes locked on screens displaying plummeting numbers. The financial system, already fragile, began to crack under the weight of uncertainty. Then, I saw something that made my heart freeze. Power was shifting. I couldn't see exactly how, but something had changed in leadership. Some leaders were gone, whether by force, resignation, or something else, I didn't know. Others had stepped in to fill the vacuum, but their eyes weren't filled with concern for the people. They carried something else entirely: control, domination, an agenda. The media couldn't keep up. Conflicting reports flooded every platform. One moment, a version of the truth was being told. Then, in an instant, it was rewritten. People were desperate, glued to their phones, televisions, computers, searching for what was real. But confusion was intentional. Suddenly, I became aware of something beyond the physical world. A war was raging, not with guns or missiles, but in the spiritual realm. I saw forces clashing, darkness against light, angels against demons, not symbols, but real. The forces of darkness weren't hiding anymore. They were moving boldly, working through people, through deception, and I saw who they were after. Not just world leaders, not just governments. They were after the hearts of everyday people. The battle wasn't just for nations, it was for souls. Fear and deception were their greatest weapons, and I saw them spreading like poison. I turned to Jesus, my heart pounding. He never looked away from me. "This is what is coming," he said. I turned back to the world below. This was no longer a distant future. It had begun. I asked, "Lord, what do we do?" His answer was clear: "You must tell them." And then, in an instant, I was ripped away. The tunnel of light swallowed me, and before I could resist, I was falling back. Pain. The first thing I felt was pain. Crushing, overwhelming. My chest ached, my head throbbed, and then, air. I gasped, sucking in a desperate breath. I wasn't in eternity anymore. I was back. Alive. I heard voices. Machines beeping, doctors shouting in disbelief. My mother whispered my name, trembling. I had been dead. No pulse, no oxygen. The doctors had called it. And yet, here I was, breathing, alive. They called it a medical miracle, but I knew the truth. I had been sent back, not just for another chance at life, but for a mission. At first, I thought people would listen. How could they not? I had died, and yet I was here. But I quickly realized the truth is not always easy to hear. Some mocked me. You were hallucinating. It was just your brain shutting down. Others dismissed me entirely. The world isn't ending. You're just another religious fanatic. But then there were the ones who listened. The ones who pulled me aside, eyes wide, hearts open, whispering, "Tell me more." They had already felt it. Something was coming. And now, I'm telling you, March is only the beginning. I wasn't given exact dates, but I saw enough to know we are running out of time. This isn't about politics. It isn't about governments. This is about souls. The battle isn't against nations or leaders. It is spiritual. And if we don't turn back to Jesus now, what comes next will be worse. But this is not a message of fear. This is a message of hope. If you're watching this, it's not by accident. Maybe you felt it too. That deep, unshakable sense that something is off. That the world is spiraling toward something bigger than what we see on the news. Maybe you've ignored it. Maybe you've told yourself things will get better. Or maybe, deep down, you already know the truth. Jesus is real. He is coming soon, and we must turn back before it's too late. The door is closing, but it's not closed yet. There is still time to repent. There is still time to seek Jesus with your whole heart. There is still time to warn others. If this message speaks to you, don't ignore it. Share it. Someone out there needs to hear this. Because the next few months will change everything. And what happens next? That choice is ours.